So, greetings and welcome to Expert Opinion. I'm Tim Winkler, and today I'm talking with two giants of the research metrics world. People are helping to ask new questions and hopefully find some new answers about why universities exist and what they focus their time upon. Cameron Neylon is Professor of Research Communications in the Centre for Culture and Technology at Curtin University's School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry and co-lead of the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative. And James Wilsdon is Professor of Research Policy at University College London and Director of the Research on Research Institute. Welcome to you both. So here's a question for you both, which is a challenge. Australia, the business model of Australia's universities has been built largely on international student revenue cross-subsidising research for a number of years. A lot of international student revenue comes on the back of good rankings from these very ranking systems you're describing. How do we reconcile that issue where there is an increasing concern about the validity of rankings and yet we're reliant upon it for future research revenue?
Well, I mean, we all recognise the ways in which rankings are used. I mean, there is also a lot of lazy thinking that gets attached to rankings. And I mean, the example in Western Australia right now is a good one of that, where ostensibly the government is proposing, the state government is proposing, or at least testing the waters for a merger between four universities on the basis that this combined mega university would somehow rocket up the rankings. But, you know, that's not the case. That's not how the rankings work. And so at the very least, one wants to be bringing the rankings into policy discussions with some actual methodological understanding of their the way they actually operate. Otherwise, you're really in danger of letting as we say in our piece for you, of letting the rankings tail wag the strategic dog. But I think much more broadly, even aside from those kind of rather ill-conceived proposals, there is as Cameron says, I mean, there's a growing recognition that if you want to be able to manage and pursue a distinctive set of national priorities through your higher education and research system, then outsourcing the job of determining what counts as good, what counts as quality, what counts as impact to a bunch of unaccountable rankers in a office in some other country isn't necessarily a particularly good strategy. And I mean, again, as an outsider to Australia, as a visitor, it's weird to me. It's quite sort of paradoxical that you can have a debate, and I know it's a contentious debate, about so-called national interest tests at the level of individual grants, which I don't support either as a policy proposal. But if you're going to have national interest tests in whatever form, even though they're now watered down, and then you abandon as a government any levers or mechanism to pursue the national interest in an aggregate sense through the system as a whole, it seems to me you're in a really weird place. So I just don't really understand that logic. And I think, it is really important that we understand, the statistical illiteracy of the sort of fake, the misplaced concreteness that we see in international rankings, and also that we do, as governments and as universities, yes, of course, we understand the need to use them in certain ways in marketing, but also continue to try and push the rankings themselves to become methodologically more robust, more rigorous, more transparent than they have been. And they've been a bit of the system that's really lagged behind parallel debates in other areas of research assessment. They've proved themselves very impervious. And the more we sort of just say, oh, well, they're there, we can't do anything about them, the more we kind of contribute to that problem rather than solving it. And, they haven't been there forever. These things only emerged 20 years ago or less. They aren't some fixed dynamic of the system. So I do think it's incumbent on government and on big universities to really show some leadership, show some backbone in actually trying to fix this problem.
I think it's regarded as a truism in Australia that international students look at these rankings, though the questions about which rankings they're looking at and why, I think it sometimes gets a bit brushed over. I agree with James. I think the key point is you can be instrumental about this, in which case you need to be really sharp on what those rankings do and how you can shift them. One of the things that's very clear, in fact, in work we've done at Koki, my colleague Carl Wang, collaboration with some folks at University of Amsterdam, really showed quite strongly that the thing that Australia suffers from in rankings performance is nothing to do with actual research performance and everything to do with visibility and reputation. And that's probably the most extreme example of that is the ARWU, where the only option you have for climbing up that prestige ranking is to buy in some more Nobel Prize winners, because that's what the metric is. So I think if you're going to be instrumental about it, and people who are running these billion-dollar institutions need to be business-oriented and business-minded about this, then you've got to be using good intelligence and good strategic thinking in terms of how you're going to tackle that and apply these instrumentally as part of an overall strategy. But again, I would say it's easy for me to say it from where I sit, obviously not as one of those leaders in one of those institutions. But you've also got to show that leadership. So you've got to show that you're looking at something better. The long-term attracting students is based on your intellectual reputation, the qualities of your work, not on some magic random numbers that have been pulled out of a hat, because they really are. The numbers are not in any sense reproducible or meaningful. And so you want to base a strategy on them, then there are cheaper ways to get magic numbers.
Cameron, do you feel like we're at risk of a bit of a two-speed approach where Australia is in the middle of thinking about a lot of things? In the meantime, the rest of the world is rapidly moving in some different directions.
I think it's very clear that the rest of the world, with Europe specifically in the lead, but nonetheless actually a fairly international consortium of players, is moving pretty rapidly in a number of really interesting directions around research evaluation, around open science, UNESCO open science recommendations, all of the stuff that's happening in the US at the moment with respect to open access and open science. And quite a lot of talking going on here at the moment. We have arguably lagged behind, certainly on things like open access over the last decade, trailing comparator nations quite poorly on that kind of those kind of measures. Some things that Australia has been pretty good at in terms of sort of data infrastructures and things like that remain, close to the front. But yes, I would say if we don't get our ducks in a row and in order, or whichever metaphor we want to work with, there is a risk of being left behind.
There, a lot of universities have them inserted into their KPIs. A lot of vice chancellors have them as part of their KPIs. When you're saying that there is a rejection or a moving away from rankings, where's that happening?
Well, if you look at specifically at efforts like the Coalition Advancing Research Assessments, this is a group of fairly traditional and powerful organisations in Europe. They're talking about wider diversity of measures, trying to understand in depth what makes universities and research institutions different from each other. And university rankings in their current form tend to be quite homogenizing. They treat everyone as one size fits all kind of solution. The International Network of Research Management Societies has a More Than Our Rank initiative, where institutions can sign up and talk about what is it beyond any rankings that is distinctive about the institution. And actually a few Australian institutions have signed up for that initiative, which is great. But that's kind of the leading edge of what I perceive as a significant shift in the expectations of people making progressive change in the research sector, where people expect greater transparency, greater flexibility, greater relevance of the kind of measures that are being used, and opaque, non-reproducible numbers generated by what are, frankly, international media corporations. They're not research organizations. Aren't really up to snuff, I would argue, as strategic indicators. So yes, there is a residue of those things and other odd and magical numbers that get inserted into KPIs at institutional and personal levels. That does seem to be more the case in Australia than a lot of other places. But yeah, I think there's definitely a shift away from that, and it would be a shame if we were left chasing this thing after everyone else got on to the next train and was heading off into the distance.
If we're thinking about the overall workforce in Australian universities, there's well over 100,000 people in universities. Maybe 5% are across some of these issues and working with these issues. What about the other 95% who are all concerned about their pay rise or what they do next week? How does this matter to them?
There's a literacy question here. There's a training and workforce question. I think it comes into a lot of Australia is short on data scientists, arguably short on data analysts and people who can work with things at that level. I'd like to see a lot more of that skill set coming into research officers and professional officers in universities, as well as amongst academics. So I think there's a place for that. What does it mean? What does it mean is whether we have a future. To some extent, it feels like the sector's coming back from a bit of a near-death experience. The previous government didn't have a great, strong view of what universities were for. And maybe this government has a clearer idea and a better idea, but I think it's a real life or death question for the sector. We have to articulate what the purposes of our institutions are. And we have to do that.
On that, Cameron, do you think the sector itself has a clear idea then of what it's there for?
I feel like from the inside, been very defensive for the last decade. And it would be great to see a stronger, more positive narrative.
There is great expertise on these topics within the Australian system. It may not be as widely dispersed as we might ideally like, but in the big funding agencies, in the ARC and the NHMRC, there's a lot of knowledge of these debates. And in academia itself, there's a really good, strong sort of grassroots network of researchers who understand these debates, are very actively engaged in them through bodies like AMOS, the Association of Interdisciplinary Meta Research and Open Science, which grew out of a group of academics originally in and around Melbourne and has become an international organization. So, Australia has traditionally been a real leader in many of these international debates and discussions. And I suppose part of the sort of plea in our piece for you is for Australia to sort of, again, retake its seat at that table and to be a vocal, active participant, collaborator, colleague in these international debates, because, we miss that contribution. We have a lot to learn from the experience of Australia in respect of many of these debates. And I'm sure Australia also has, things to gain from, learning from other systems. So, again, as an outsider and with modesty, I would encourage and urge colleagues to, return to the fray, as it were, and come and join us in trying to all work to push research systems and research evaluation in a more positive and progressive direction.
How urgent is it that we actually do something here? There's been some delays of reviews. There's been conversations heading in various directions. What does it matter if we don't actually make up our mind for another year or two?
Well, I think the specific worry that we, and I know others share this worry, is that in the race to do away with the era in particular, and I mean I understand the reasons for that, and there's a lot obviously to be done to try and improve the way any assessment framework works, in Australia. But if one just does away with it altogether and doesn't think really quite seriously and creatively about what goes in its place, then you're back to the problem we talked about earlier. You essentially cede the ground as government, as universities, as Australia as a nation, to largely unaccountable overseas actors in international research. And I think that's to Australia and to Australian universities' ultimate loss rather than gain.
I'd say there's a risk of going both too fast and too slow. As James is saying, you can throw the baby out with the bathwater in the rush to reduce burden, save money, save time. And so there is that risk of moving too precipitously, not thinking through the consequences. I think there's also a risk of simply being left behind and not having an influence over the kinds of international conversations that are taking place at the moment. So, as fast as possible, as slowly as necessary, to steal a line from the European Commission on open data. We have some real structural issues in the sector in Australia and globally. They're not going away. We do need to think through and address them. We also probably need to take the opportunity that's afforded by a new government to reflect and take our time to get those things right as they move forward. So I guess that's a very equivocal, that's typical academic on one side, yes, and on the other side, no, kind of answer. But I do think it is a bit of both.
Terrific. Cameron and James, thank you so much for your time. I'm hoping we'll hear much more from you in the months to come, because there's a lot further for this debate to play out, I think.
Great. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.